Douglas Murray, so happy to have you on the show again today.
Great to be with you.
You just said to me moments ago, how was the show this morning? And I said to you, let's talk about that. This weekend on Fox and Friends, we have been almost exclusively dedicated to covering the passing of Queen Elizabeth II and the ascension of King Charles III. Douglas, it is a difficult topic for me. It is difficult. And I would like to think it's because I'm an American. These are my complicated thoughts that I only saw some light in talking to you offset this weekend. I'd love for you to walk with me through. And that is, I feel like as a birthright of the revolution, I shouldn't have to care about the monarchy. That my forefathers died and won a war so that I could care more about Texas, Alabama on this Saturday than the monarchy in England. But I do feel, and I think you helped highlight this in a conversation we had this weekend, that I should appreciate the value of constancy and tradition that is represented in the monarchy and should be marked with the passing of the Queen and the ascension of the King. Why should I care about the monarchy?
You don't have to, and many people don't, especially. My own view has always been to take as little interest in the nitty-gritty of who's up, who's down, who's in, who's out, as to just respect and revere the institution, which is something I do. Of course, as an American, you have reason not to want to care about a British monarchical system. This country had its disagreements with the monarch in the UK, shall we say. So you're right, your forefathers had a different attitude towards the monarchy. However, in the modern era, and particularly in the reign of Queen Elizabeth II, I think that has changed to a great degree, and there are a couple of reasons for that, if I can say so. The first is this. Our societies in Britain and America have, for the last 7 decades or more, effectively run off the moral success of the Second World War. What I mean by that is, people attack us, they criticize us, they say, America, you're no good as a country, you've done this, you've done that. Britain, you're no good as a country, you've done this, you've done that. But in our lifetimes, and I think probably in the lifetimes of our parents and children, that sense that actually we did a really good thing, the most good thing that any country could do. That in the case of Britain, we stood alone against Nazi Germany for a time, then, with our allies, including America, managed to defeat the worst force of evil in history. We have run off the value and the virtue of that greatest generation for a long time now. It may be dwindling. But Queen Elizabeth II was the last great link to that generation. She was, as a girl, she gave her first address to the children of the Commonwealth who had been dispersed by the war. Children from my own country of birth, from Great Britain, who'd been sent abroad. Had been sent abroad for safety to countries like America, like Canada. And she spoke to those children around the world when she was herself only a teenager. And in 1940 told them, she said, all will be well. And she said, we will get through this. We will get through. We will win. And, of course, the significance of her and her family during the conflict was huge. Other countries in Europe, the Netherlands, for instance, when it was invaded by the Nazis, or before it was invaded, the monarchy fled. They fled to London. There was talk in the worst days of 1940 that the monarchy should leave the UK, particularly that the princesses, Princess Elizabeth and her sister, Princess Margaret, should leave the United Kingdom to go to safety in Canada, so that if the Nazis invaded, as they were expected, the monarchy would not be overtaken. And when the Queen Mother, the late Queen Mother, the Queen Elizabeth's mother, was asked about this, she memorably said, "I will not leave without the princesses." Hang on, let me get this right. She said, "I will not leave without the girls. The king will not leave without me. The king will not leave." It was absolutely clear that the monarchy was not going to retreat. And because the monarchy wasn't going to retreat and go to another country, the British people wouldn't retreat either. It would have been a terrible sign if the royals had started to leave, and they didn't. They stuck it out with the rest of the people. When Buckingham Palace was bombed, famously, the Queen Mother said, "I can now look the East End in the eye." The point is that that Queen Elizabeth was the last reach back to that. Her first prime minister was Winston Churchill, of course, as a young queen. And on VE Day, when victory in Europe came, Queen Elizabeth II, as she became, was on the balcony with her father, the late king, and Winston Churchill to join in celebrating with the crowd's victory over the Nazis in Europe. So she was, this is a long answer, but she was the last link to that. The last person with a really good memory of the war and somebody who helped us fight and win the war. And there's one other thing, if I may, which is this. She represented a set of values which I believe many Americans, as well as many British people, fear have gone from our society. I mentioned this in my New York Post column today, but the value, for instance, of putting others above yourself. Not saying it's all about me, not moaning about yourself. Queen Elizabeth's thing that she learned from her mother was never complain, never explain. People don't want to hear your complaints. There was a saying in Britain in the past I used to grow up with, mustn't grumble. Why should you not grumble? Because everybody could grumble. You don't, because you'll only make other people's days worse. Queen Elizabeth said, as a young woman, she said, my life, whether it be short or long, will be dedicated to your service, to the service of her country. And this is, among many other values she had, including her very deep Christian faith, these are values, I think, that a lot of people sense that we have lost, and that she was the last embodiment of those values.
You have just held up the Queen as a symbol of value and the marking of time. I'm curious, what do you think changed? Those values of selflessness or putting others above yourself, and the bravery in the United States, we would have referred to that same generation as the greatest generation, who stood up against, as you pointed out, one of the evilest empires, one of the evilest movements in history. Something seemingly changed, because what you're talking about today is not simply the loss of a woman, not simply the loss of a queen, but the loss of a generation.
Yes, that's exactly right. It's a generation of my grandparents. I mean, we all in Britain, I think lots of people in America know this. They knew the type of person that era produced and created. And it was a remarkable generation. It was satirized by some people, particularly in Britain. People talked of the stiff upper lip, for instance. I'm a great fan of the stiff upper lip. I don't see any problem with it. I think it can have downsides. It's good to be able to connect with your emotions, but it's not endlessly good. People don't want to see you tearing up all the time. They don't want to hear you moaning all the time, talking about how bad your lot is when your lot is likely to be better than most people's, or certainly other people's or someone's. I think that getting through things, stoicism is one word for it, is an attitude we sort of lost as times got easier and softer and much more. We expected people to kind of do what they wanted and not to put others first, not to put the nation first. We went through a period where people even sort of basically spat on the society that had produced them, and that's one of the things we're in at the moment. And so I think it is good to be reminded of what true patriotism in the best sense is, what true service in the best sense is, because if we remember it, then it's possible that we could re-embody it.
If we re-embody it, we have our work cut out for us, because we are in the moment that must be whatever the opposite is of stoicism. Mm-hmm. I also like stoicism, by the way. I follow could there be a more shallow and modern statement than the one I'm about to make? I follow stoicism accounts on Instagram. But we're living in the opposite of the stoic age. We're living in whatever that may be, the subjective emotionalism age.
Well, I'd say the your truth age. My truth, your truth. Let's call the whole thing off, Yes, and it's not, I don't want to dwell on it this time, but I think it wouldn't have escaped some people's attention that even some younger royals seem not to have been following the example of the late Queen. And I think it's worth reflecting on what consequences that has. I don't want to criticize Prince Harry in the week that his grandmother's passed away, but Prince Harry was very, very much revered in the United Kingdom when he pulled his life around in his early 20s, joined the army, served in Afghanistan, got enormous public support. And when he married his now wife, Meghan Markle, there was enormous public support for this. The crowds turned out by the thousands to cheer them on, partly because we saw it as being a way of modern Britain showing itself even in the institution of the monarchy, that the sort of era of princes only marrying other, royals and so on, that had gone away, and that there had been a more egalitarian approach. Well, people were very happy about that. But you can see in public attitudes, I would suggest, the respect the public gives when they see people doing their duty, as opposed to the respect the public doesn't give when they see people who are seen to be out for themselves.
So I have such great respect for your insight. I would love to walk through with you some of my thoughts, not unlike how we began this conversation, that seem at odds with one another when it comes to the monarchy, when it comes to the British Empire. So I'm going to tell you this story, and I want to tie it into, obviously, current events as well. So first of all, here's the story. I was just at parent-teacher night the other night with my oldest son, and I walked into one of his classes, which is called World Cultures, and they're going to go through various cultures.
I
know, red flags go up. Yeah. I felt the same. But, I do want my children exposed to cultures across the world. Mm-hmm. I want them to learn. The question is how. And, for example, one of the things they're first going to focus on is a mock trial on the Australian government's treatment of Aboriginal population. And it's not too far removed from probably the history of the United States of America and its encounters with American Indians. And I was telling my son, I said, let's go through this. I will greatly respect the ninth grader who takes on the case. It's a mock trial on behalf of the Australian government. But you get to this place where you start talking about culture and whether or not cultures are relative, whether or not some cultures are superior over others, and whether or not empires and colonialists are benign, beneficial, or malignant forces within history.
Sure.
And right now we're having a debate being foisted upon the public of whether or not the British Empire is responsible for the evils of colonialism. And in fact, is colonialism evil?
Yeah, there's a lot there. As you know, I write about some of this in my latest book, The War on the West. I think that there has been a very negative reappraisal of British history and American history in recent years, where the whole reframing of America has been the reframing that America has an original sin, and that the original sin is slavery. I say to hell with that. I don't believe it. Obviously, I deplore slavery like everybody else. But why does America have a founding sin? What's the founding sin of Uganda? What's the founding sin of Haiti? Or why do you do that to America unless you're going to do it to everyone? What's the founding sin of Nigeria? I mean, we wouldn't do this in any other situation. What founding sin of India? I don't know. You go on and on. Founding sin of Sri Lanka. What is it? Is it that there isn't one? Is it they're so good they don't have one? Is it just us that's bad? That's how it's currently taught to American students. And that's how the American public are being taught to think. And I say that the same thing is happening to an extent in Britain with the whole argument about the colonial era. In some ways, it's a useful debate, and in some ways it's not. The way in which it's not useful is you and I and everyone else are here because history happened. And there isn't a darn thing we can do about it. And we don't know how we would have acted ourselves because we don't know what views we would have held in the past, other than we'd have probably held the same views that almost everybody else held. For instance, there is a historical fallacy that American students and British students are taught today, which is that they would go back in time and they would, for instance, be anti-slavery in the 1700s and go, oh, yeah? You sure about that? You sure you wouldn't be doing what everybody else in the world, as well as your country, was doing? Yeah, you would have probably been doing that. It's like the old thing of, if I was a German in the 1940s, I'd have resisted Hitler. No, you wouldn't. You'd have been garroted and guillotined. You wouldn't. You'd have been a Nazi. Almost certainly. We have this historical fallacy of looking back at the past and judging the past and thinking we would have acted as we act today in the past, and that's nonsense. Most people in the past, this is a long-winded answer, sorry, but most people in the past believe that the way you accrued wealth and power was by invasion, by annexation, by military victory, and much more. And the native tribes in America, most of them operated in that way. Most of Central America operated that way. The Mayans, the Aztecs, most of those civilizations were not vegan pacifist civilizations. They would have failed many of the tests we have in 2022. The British Empire is a complex story, as the story of, I think, most empires is. The empires European countries acquired in the 18th and 19th centuries, they disposed of in the 20th centuries. And I would say that among all of the empires, and perhaps you would say I would say this, wouldn't I? But I think of all of the empires, the British Empire was, first of all, not just the most successful, but the most benign. And secondly, that it was the empire which decolonized best. And in recent days, there have been some loud ignoramuses on some of the networks talking about the decolonization process, pretending that, for instance, the British Empire was genocidal, which is, of course, nonsense. If it was genocidal, people wouldn't be there at the moment. But secondly, these people are so ignorant because they do not ask themselves, if the British Empire was so terrible, why did the Commonwealth come about? Now, the Commonwealth came about in the wake of the colonial period because countries wanted to retain a link with the formerly colonial power. And Queen Elizabeth II presided over the very successful, very dear to her heart, the Commonwealth, very successfully presided over this period in which the countries that had been in the empire remained in the Commonwealth and remained in communion with Britain. And that has been an incredibly important force, and it's a demonstration that the period of decolonization went far better than it could have done. Look at the falling apart of the German Empire, or indeed the French Empire. Look at the wars that resulted.
You said so much, not only do I want to dive deeper on, but that I agree with. But let me play devil's advocate on the last statement. I feel like if there was someone sitting here who disagrees with Douglas Murray or with Will Cain, they would say, wouldn't the success of the Commonwealth be attributed to the British Empire installing an aristocracy and a sort of Vichy government in many of these places that would have paid homage and allegiance to the British Empire?
But we didn't. I mean, look at the governance of the worst example, maybe, a country like Zimbabwe. I mean, Robert Mugabe kept up his rule by pretending that Zimbabwe was still somehow run by the British. And he kept up this campaign of lies whilst halving the average life expectancy of the average Zimbabwean and making him and his wife very, very rich. It was common in the post-colonial era for people to blame every problem on the colonialists. And they did it because they enriched themselves as they impoverished their countries and misruled them. And that was the case in country after country. However, there are also success cases. I mean, nobody talks about the reparations in Singapore. Why? Singapore was a colonial country. Well, Singapore is a great success story. I mean, there is a big debate in India, which is probably the most important country if we're going to talk about colonialism. There was a big debate in India because India was, of course, famously the crown and the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. Was the result of British rule in empire a good or a bad thing? I would say it's a mixed bag. There were some bad things. Much of it was good. When India became independent, she inherited not just all of the infrastructure that the colonial era had provided, but among other things, the Rolls-Royce of modern India, which was the civil service that the British had put in place. That meant that India was governed after independence infinitely better than most countries would have been. So anyway, I could go on. The point is that colonialism is complex for reasons that our own era doesn't want to accept. We had a period where colonialism was celebrated. We've had a period where nothing good can be said about colonialism. And I would say that the debate should settle somewhere in the middle, which is there are ups and downs and we should be able to weigh them.
So the value or the question of my devil's advocacy was less about the value of the British Empire and what it left in its wake, but whether or not a free people would have chosen to remain as a part of the Commonwealth. I want to back into that, though, because now I'm going to back up to the original point where we began. And you said something fascinating in this that I wholeheartedly agree with. We teach history in the West, America and Great Britain apparently, as though it began with us. And whatever began or what existed before us was pastoral, serene, and utopic.
Always, yes.
And then we come along and bring violence and deprivation. Yeah. And it ignores the fact that the history of humanity is one of a fight over resources, land. It's violent. It embodies slavery in almost every civilization. The American Indians were incredibly violent with one another and took each other into bondage and slavery. And the American colonists arrive and didn't suddenly spring upon the continent these evils which did not exist. And so I think that's interesting to start to force upon people this idea to understand that the true course of history has been one of conquer. And what you're living in is history written by the conquerors. But don't pretend that the losers in this equation lived by a different code of ethics. They simply lost.
Yes, that's true. I agree with that. There seems to be some kind of current thing, which is that any defeated peoples must have been better and unfairly treated, having been defeated. And as I say, all of history is complex, but we're here because of it. Nobody acts perfectly in history, but we should be able to judge relative merits and much more. I believe that, on balance, I think it's a jolly good thing that Christopher Columbus stumbled upon America. On balance, I think it's a very good thing that America came into being. On balance, I think it's a terrific thing for the world that the revolution in America succeeded at a time when what it was trying to do was only being tried in one other place, France, and that became a tyranny. On balance, I think it was a good thing that I think Britain has been a force for good in the world. On balance, I believe America has been a terrific force for good in the world. I don't know that could be said of all countries. I think there are countries that I wouldn't want to single out necessarily. Well, maybe I would, which that couldn't be said of. But I think that the English-speaking democracies have an enormous amount to be proud of. It's not an unalloyed story of virtue, but nor is it a story only of vice. But compare the British Empire with any others, and I think it comes out very well. And the period, as I say, of decolonization has come out very well. There is much you can blame Britain for, but much that they should be celebrated for.
Well, that's why I wanted to go with the judgment of the British Empire. So if you set the groundwork that those who yell colonist would have also been colonizers.
Of course they would.
Had they won.
Of course they would.
Then you can say, well, that is the commonality of humanity. Then the question is, what do you do with your empire? And then we can judge an empire based upon that foundation.
Yes.
And I think it's interesting. So there we say, what was the value of the British Empire? How would you compare it, say, if Robert Mugabe had the power to expand his power across all of Africa or across the globe? Then you can begin to judge the British Empire. And I think you have a very strong case to make that it was, as you said, a force for good.
Yes, and as I say, I was asked recently, what's the best defense of the British Empire? And I slightly alarmed my interviewer by saying Amritsar, referring to the massacre that occurred not long after World War One, where British troops opened fire on a crowd at Amritsar, killing many people. This shouldn't, by the way, be confused with Indira Gandhi's order of a massacre at Amritsar, where many more people were killed in the 1970s. I wouldn't want anyone to confuse these two things at all. But the Amritsar massacre carried out by the British was, as Winston Churchill said in the House of Commons in 1919, the darkest day of the British Empire. Why do people say this? Why do I mention this as being an example of the benevolence of the British Empire? Because we remember it. Because everybody knows about it. It's not forgotten in India or in Britain. If Amritsar had been carried out by the Germans, it wouldn't have reached a blip on the radar. If it had been carried out by the Russians, no one would know the name. It was because the British Empire, which did not behave like this, oversaw this, that we remember it. And there is much to be said for that. We remember the darkest days, most empires and most conquering powers' darkest days are not even registered.
Well, I really like that answer. And I like it because it also acknowledges that, as you've said several times in our conversation, on balance, it has been a force for good. It's not to pretend that anything is perfection. I'm sure that we can easily dive into British history, certainly American history, and see the atrocities. Atrocities were carried out against the American Indians. The question is of one on balance as compared to the existence and potentiality of other empires. Now, I want to bring it full circle back to my kids' world culture class. Is it, in your estimation, Douglas, so an ethical question, is it appropriate to be a force for good? Okay, on balance, a force for good. And what I mean by that literally is a force. So the question specifically for my son in that class will be a mock trial on Australia's laws that force acculturated Aboriginal children. I know very little about Australian history, but I do know that took place in America as well. Took Native American children, taught them English, took them away from their families forcefully, and took them into schools and forced acculturation. And this takes us back to cultural relativism. You know, you can put objective metrics on this stuff, right? Some cultures produce longer lifespans, better health outcomes, better educational outcomes. You can put metrics on the relativity of cultures. What I'm curious about is still, is it ethically correct to, I certainly don't want anybody stepping into my household and saying, I can raise your kids better than you can, and we can put quantifiable metrics on it. It happens. We have child protective services. You can have your kids taken away from you for neglect. Can you do that on a societal level, on a cultural level? Can you be a force for good and still be good?
Well, the modern answer to that is no. But the modern answer to that, effectively, by which I mean really the answer of only recent decades, is no, you oughtn't to do that. You should allow other people to get on with their lives, and you should get on with your own. But that is a very modern idea. And that wasn't an idea that people held in the past. People believed in societies being better than other societies, believed their own way of life was better than other ways of life. And sometimes that was sheer chauvinism, bigotry. Sometimes it was totally mistaken, misguided. And sometimes it was true. That, for instance, a society that knows how to become wealthier and how to grow the pie, for instance, is better than one that doesn't and will remain stagnant. Although you then get the sort of Rousseauian types who believe that actually everyone is better, always left alone, and somehow all native tribes, apart from Europeans, of course, are incredibly innocent and happy and much more. There is the famous noble savage idea, which has benighted our understanding of the world. But anyhow, in the past, people thought differently. They thought that it was, indeed, Churchill said that. He said he didn't think there was anything wrong, would not apologize for the fact that he thought that a superior civilization should conquer an inferior one, and a superior people rule an inferior people. That was a very common view in the Victorian era, and up until, I would say, the early part of the 20th century. That's fallen away, and we now believe that you essentially let people alone unless they tread on you. And I think that's probably, after recent decades of American foreign policy, the position that most people in the West hold, which is unless somebody treads on you, you basically leave everyone alone. And I'd add one rider to that, which is, and this is perhaps an important thing to say, which is that if you are to, as it were, dominate a different culture, you would do it by persuasion, not by force. There are many cultures in the world today which are completely overridden by other cultures, but not by force. Much of the anti-Americanism which has existed in Europe in my own lifetime has come about from a dislike of American culture washing through, for instance, French culture. That hasn't been done by force. And it's interesting because, of course, it's not inevitable. The French can resist that and do. If they don't want American fast food coming their way, they don't have to buy it. Harder with American popular culture, you might say. But American popular culture, for instance, is washed across the world, not by force, but by success. I think it's the same with ideas. I think that good ideas can be transmitted without any force, and people can learn from them. But if they didn't want them, our current consensus is, in that case, you wouldn't force them upon them.
I think that's a wonderful answer. It also shows just the importance of our debate over the value of freedom of speech. If
Yes.
we are truly living in the informational age and we are dealing with, how about this, the colonization of ideas, then you need to be able to have a free flow of ideas.
That's right. That's why ideas matter, because ideas create the universe, and they create the ecosystem that you live in. And if you can't have a proper discussion and a proper exchange of ideas, you can't arrive at proper and sensible conclusions, and you will be held hostage by nonsensical conclusions. And unfortunately, that's one of the problems of our current age.
So we'll head towards a conclusion with this, and I hope I don't share anything that you didn't want me to share, but you made it clear to me yesterday when we were talking that the vision of the monarchy is tied deeply to, for example, the vision of the flag, that it is patriotism.
Yes.
Again, through the eyes of an American, I see this, and I can understand how that represents patriotism to you. Through my eyes, I see two conflicting ideas. I see one, this very anti-American idea of unearned status, of privilege that is literally benighted or granted or born into. And it's so antithetical to who we are as Americans.
Why do you do it then?
And in what manner?
Why do you do it?
What do I do?
Hereditary principle in this country.
Like, for example?
The Bushes, the Clintons, the Bidens.
Oh, I thought it
just
was...
to start, the Kennedys. You want me to go on?
Oh, I thought it was more directed. I thought the you wasn't proverbial. I thought it was directed directly at me. Why do I do it?
No, I don't know if you do it well. I don't know
that I do it.
But isn't it an interesting question?
Yes, I think it's a matter of celebrity in this country.
Why? Okay, here's one of my favorite defenses of the system of constitutional monarchy. By having a constitutional monarchy, we do not have hereditary politics.
You have no...
It's highly uncommon in the modern era in Britain to have the discussion of lines of descent in politics.
In the House of Lords?
Well, the House of Lords is now almost entirely appointed by the governments of the day. There are some hereditary peers that have very little power, and they were phased out 20 years ago. My point is in elective politics.
In the House of Commons, very
House
little.
of Commons, we don't talk in terms of political dynasties. Nobody is like, I wonder if Mark Thatcher's going to run. Why would he?
Do you think that you don't have it because of the monarchy, or it's yet to come as you sort of embrace celebrity culture in the very American way?
Well, this isn't just to do with celebrity culture. Here's what I think happens. This is a really interesting subject. I believe that we as a people are very interested in watching DNA work out.
Interesting.
We're very interested in seeing how far someone can go away from the DNA that they're born with. We're interested in seeing the ways in which it goes wrong, the way in which you get black sheep. We're interested in seeing continuity. Now, in Britain, this is best seen in the national interest of the monarchy. We are interested in, for instance, Diana's sons. Will they be more like Diana, more like their father, for instance? There is always an errant prince, sometimes, a real wrong un. And historically, by historical terms, my gosh, errant princes were a problem. In America, this same interest is played out, this same obsession is played out, but it's played out on political dynasties. And you play it out, for instance, in the Kennedys. You play it out in the clans of politics, even the Bidens. People are interested in the ideas of what is Hunter Biden, but the question of what you do with the prince.
You think you cathartically work this out in Great Britain because of the monarchy?
Through the monarchy. It's because we have the obsession with the hereditary monarchy, we do not have the obsession of hereditary politics.
Let's take this
Nobody is interested in whether the Blairs are going to be running for office again.
This is going to show my myopia, but take me, you have a much better view of the world than do I. Is that the case across Europe? Is there hereditary politics in any of the countries that maintain a monarchy?
Well, I mean, one that springs to mind is Trudeau, where essentially if his father hadn't have been prime minister before him, it's very unlikely that an elementary school teacher with nice hair would have become prime minister. You know, I mean, he's totally unqualified for the role. And it seems that his name was some use. So, and of course, Canada is part of the Commonwealth, and the Queen, now the King, presides over it.
Germany, France, Spain.
I would say that, well, you know, most of these countries have some kind of families or families that they're interested in still following. But it is an interesting thing in American politics, the obsession with clans. And, you know, I mean, like, you know, will Chelsea Clinton run was a serious question people talked about. Like, I mean,
Michelle Obama.
Michelle Obama. Why, as I've said many times, does the American presidency until Donald Trump, why did the American presidency for a couple of decades have to be seen to be constantly rotated between two families?
Right.
Like, that's a very medieval thing to do. You know, you have the Plantagenets or the Tudors or the Stuarts. I mean, like,
I want to believe you. I think it's appropriate criticism. I think that there, you know, I've used the term celebrity culture, but I think it is so difficult to achieve critical mass in a country of 350 million people that having simply name recognition is of such value from a marketing perspective. You will probably see Donald Trump Jr. run because he has name recognition. I'm not saying that with any insight. I'm saying based upon the way we elevate Michelle Obama or Chelsea Clinton or any number of Bushes or Kennedys, it's just simply the name recognition breaks through 350 million people.
Well, yes, there's certainly something. I'd also say, though, there is this thing, I mean, and this isn't a criticism of American society at all, I deeply admire and revere, but look at the way in which, in the 19th century, for instance, presidents in America, and I think into the 20th century with Teddy Roosevelt, people were reaching back to the founding. And actually, the founding families, it was important. I mean, Washington's children, you know, by the time of Lincoln,
obviously.
Adams, there's a very important thing of, are we still touching the thing that set us off? That's a very important, and I think, and a lot of important capital was stored in that, rightly and understood to be stored in that. The monarchy basically deals with all of that. It puts that all in one box.
Well, I told you I had two competing thoughts, and one was sort of being antagonistic to the idea of unearned prestige and privilege. But the other is understanding, in which we're touching on here now at the end, the simple value of tradition. If something, this argument has constantly been made, and I think it has value. Not unlike analyzing an empire, it should be analyzed on balance. But because something has survived over human centuries and millennia, it insists that it has value. It would not survive without its value. Now, obviously, that doesn't cover everything because slavery was a human practice that survived for millennia. And that doesn't mean, therefore, it was a tradition of value.
Sure.
But by and large, on balance, if this is a practice humans have continued for thousands of years, there's some value to derive.
Well, that's what I think. But I'm conservative. And so I believe that that things that have lasted and have had worth in the past are likely to be having worth and offering you worth in the present. I mean, I regard it as being one of the most, I think it's a character difference among some people, and it's one of the main political differences. There is always an interesting, by the way, complexity in American conservatism, which Roger Scruton, Robert Bork, and others, I often discussed this with the complexity of a conservatism which is based in a country that started with revolution. It's a very interesting.
Very interesting.
So conservatism with a small c is much easier in Britain than I think it is in America. But conservatism is rooted in a belief that there are institutions that you have inherited, beliefs you have inherited, which are worth holding on to. And the opposite is rebellion or revolutionaryism, which says, no, we'll get rid of this thing, and we've got a new idea. And there's a virtue in that as well, as we know. If America hadn't have had a new idea, things wouldn't have would have gone differently.
Yeah.
It's by no means to say, but that's one of the values of conservatism. And Her Majesty, the late Majesty, the Queen, was as I say, not a political figure, but she did in broadcasts and other times always stress the importance of holding on to the ideals we have that are good and that have been handed down to us. She said in one of her addresses in the 1950s, I think it was, she said, that a foolish age would cast out all the things that we've inherited. And, in my own view, the casting out of things too readily leaves you with a problem. It leaves you with the problem that you might need those things again. I see one of the problems in our era in America as being the casting out of historical figures and virtues and values that we may need again. For instance, our age has cast out the idea of manliness, of masculinity as a good as well as a negative. Well, that's a mistake. Why? Because you might need it again. The rest of human history, the next century, may not entirely be run by asexual vegans, and maybe you don't want to create a generation of people who think their own feelings of the utmost importance. And, maybe you don't want to create a generation of entirely fragile people who fear ideas and words and worry desperately when they walk out into the street that a word might offend them. Maybe you want to create tougher people than that. Maybe you want to create more resilient people. So that's why you don't throw out values from the past, because you might need them again.
Otherwise, you might find your entire civilization on the wrong end of the colonizer.
Well, that's absolutely one of my favorite taunts to my opponents is to say, if you didn't like the era of British dominance and you didn't like the era of American dominance, you're going to love the era of Chinese dominance.
What a great way to end this conversation on the fact that we've seen the passing of not just a woman and not just a queen, but of perhaps, sadly, hopefully not, the passing of a set of values, and therefore giving us some meaning into the value of a monarchy. Douglas Murray, thank you.
Great pleasure.
Hey, it's Will Cain. Click here to subscribe to the Fox News channel on YouTube. It's the best way to get our latest interviews and highlights. And click to subscribe to the Will Cain Podcast for full episodes right now.